In 1888, the British Empire commanded the entire globe, yet its most elite police force, the H Division of the Metropolitan Police, was physically paralyzed by a single smog-choked square mile in its own capital, the East End of London. Just pause and think about the sheer weight of that paradox. Queen Victoria's military could subjugate entire continents and project power across oceans, but a fully armed, highly trained Metropolitan Police officer would find his hands physically shaking before his midnight patrol in Whitechapel. Why? Because this wasn't standard law enforcement. This was an assignment to an abyss. And that is exactly why we need to look much closer at what actually happened when the sun went down. To understand the profound psychological dread of the H Division, you must completely strip away the modern, romanticized image of Victorian London. There were no charming cobblestone strolls here. Instead, imagine a suffocating sensory deprivation tank. The infamous London fog, a toxic, heavy blend of industrial coal smoke and freezing river mist, acted as a living antagonist. It aggressively swallowed the faint glow of the gas lamps. It ate the sound of heavy police boots. But there is a far more terrifying nuance to this environment. The darkness didn't just hide criminals. It actively stripped the police of their absolute greatest advantage: communication. A lone patrolman isolated in the East End was entirely cut off from the known world. He had no radio. He had no rapid response backup waiting in a vehicle. He had only a heavy wooden truncheon and a simple brass whistle. And blowing that whistle in the freezing, thick air felt like ringing a dinner bell for everything that hated the uniform. This changes everything about how we view these men. They weren't cowards. They were hardened veterans of the streets who had seen the absolute worst of human nature. Yet the psychological weight of this specific district was enough to break them. The silence of the fog wasn't empty. It was heavy with the implication of what was watching them from the unlit, nameless alleys. Tell me honestly, let's put you in their heavy leather boots for a moment. If you were handed a flickering lantern and a brass whistle in 1888, knowing exactly what waited in the dark, would you willingly walk into that fog? Most people would turn in their badge right then and there. Stepping into the smog meant surrendering your safety to a district that operated by its own ruthless, invisible laws. But the officers weren't just afraid of the invisible shadows. They were terrified of the very bricks that surrounded them. Part 2. The Brick Spiderweb. The Metropolitan Police didn't fear the people first. They feared the claustrophobic, weaponized geometry of the Whitechapel rookeries. Forget everything you know about traditional city planning. The East End wasn't designed, it mutated. It grew like a concrete fungus into a literal labyrinth designed specifically to trap intruders and shield the guilty. And here is the terrifying detail that history books almost always gloss over. The rookeries were an intricate, interconnected web of unmapped courtyards, subterranean cellars, and blind alleys that aggressively narrowed to mere inches. A broad-shouldered beat cop would physically scrape his heavy wool uniform against the damp, rotting bricks just trying to squeeze through the passageways. The architecture itself felt heavy, leaning inward, as if the buildings were trying to crush the narrow streets below. The smell of rotting timber and stagnant water hung in the air, a constant reminder of the decay that defined the district. He was entirely restricted. His movement was choked, which meant that escaping an ambush was mathematically impossible. If you took a wrong turn, you didn't just end up on a different street. You ended up in a dead-end courtyard surrounded by 4 stories of hostile, starving residents staring down at you from black, glassless windows. It was a perfect urban trap. This physical confinement created an unbearable psychological pressure. When a police officer finally blew his whistle for help, the sound didn't travel in a clean, straight line. It bounced off 5 different brick walls, creating a disorienting, scattered echo. Backup couldn't find you, even if they desperately wanted to. You were entirely swallowed by the architecture. Let's make this visceral. Look around your room right now. Imagine the walls slowly closing in until your shoulders scrape the damp brick on both sides. How long until pure panic sets in? That exact panic was the baseline heart rate for the H Division. Every single shadow could be a doorway. Every single doorway could be a sudden, fatal drop into a cellar not listed on any official city map. The geometry itself was aggressively hostile to the very concept of law and order. You couldn't patrol it. You could only hope to navigate it without disappearing. Yet, this twisting architecture was merely the physical cage. The true danger lay in what the cage forced its inhabitants to become. Part 3. The Economics of Despair. According to Charles Booth's infamous poverty map, the East End wasn't just a residential district, it was a sprawling infection of fatal desperation. We aren't talking about simply being poor. We are talking about a total, devastating collapse of the human condition. Booth's map literally coded these specific streets in black ink to signify the lowest class: vicious, semi-criminal. But that dark ink couldn't capture the true, suffocating tragedy. It couldn't capture the sound of hollow coughs echoing through the smog, or the sight of completely barefoot orphans scavenging in the frozen gutters. Because here is the brutal truth that changes the entire equation of policing in 1888. Standard law and order fundamentally shatter when humans are pushed past the absolute line of subsistence. The police weren't walking into a neighborhood of malicious, calculating criminals. They were walking into a volatile arena of raw, unfiltered survival. This was the dark era of the sweated trades: matchstick making, bone boiling, and grueling piecework tailoring. People worked agonizing 16-hour days inhaling toxic, debilitating fumes, only to earn barely enough to buy a single crust of stale, hardened bread. And that meant the rules of the British Empire simply did not apply here. Imagine the bone-deep cold of a Victorian winter creeping through threadbare clothes. Imagine the unbearable acidic stench of the tanneries aggressively stinging your eyes. When an officer of the H Division stepped into the alleys, he wasn't fighting an organized rebellion against the Crown. He was fighting a mother's overwhelming hunger. He was fighting a father's utter, terrifying inability to keep his children from freezing to death on a damp cellar floor. Poverty here wasn't a demographic statistic. It was a fatal, physical force of nature. When a single loaf of stale bread holds significantly more practical value than a human life, what invisible lines would you cross to survive the winter? This is the massive psychological wall the police crashed into every single night. You simply cannot threaten a desperate man with jail when his current reality is significantly worse than a prison cell. A night in a warm jail cell with a guaranteed meal was actually a luxury. Therefore, the uniform lost its power. The badge became utterly meaningless. The threat of legal punishment was entirely hollow against the crushing daily weight of starvation. This relentless survival bred a new kind of society, one that quickly organized the chaos into a shadow government the police couldn't touch. Part 4. The Shadow Government. The H Division was merely trespassing. The East End was actually ruled by the absolute chilling silence of the gang syndicates. You see, the government printed the maps, but the true authority on the streets was carved out by brutal, highly organized criminal networks like the infamous blind beggar syndicates. This wasn't petty theft. This was a sophisticated, deeply entrenched shadow economy of protection rackets, illegal bare-knuckle boxing rings, and highly coordinated smuggling operations moving goods right under the nose of the Crown. and they operated with absolute terrifying impunity. Why? Because the Metropolitan Police were fundamentally outmatched in every conceivable metric. Imagine stepping onto a cobblestone corner knowing you are a single, isolated target, wearing a highly visible uniform. Your only defense is a wooden truncheon and a brass whistle. Meanwhile, the men watching you from the shadows are armed, deeply loyal to their gang leaders, and intimately familiar with every blind alley and rooftop escape route in the district. It changes the entire dynamic of authority. The police didn't dictate the rules, they tiptoed around them. Let's paint a visceral picture of what that actually felt like. A young, exhausted beat cop pushes open the heavy wooden door of a local East End pub looking for a suspect. The smell of cheap gin and damp wool hits him instantly. But what hits him harder is the sound, or rather, the sudden, aggressive lack of it. 50 hardened, desperate men stop drinking. The scraping of chairs ceases. The low hum of conversation dies completely. Every single eye in the room locks onto the uniform. They don't draw weapons. They don't have to. The sheer, overwhelming psychological weight of that collective stare is enough to crush any illusion of control. That suffocating tension forces a realization of sheer helplessness. Tell me, drop your thoughts in the comments. Imagine walking into a crowded, hostile tavern, and instantly, every man stops talking to stare at you in dead silence. Would you hold your ground or retreat to the street? Most men retreated. They learned to look the other way, because enforcing the law in a syndicate stronghold meant risking a sudden, violent disappearance into the Thames. But as deeply entrenched and dangerous as the gang syndicates were, they weren't the most terrifying thing waiting for a lone officer on the night shift. Part 5. Sensory Deprivation. The true horror of the midnight patrol wasn't a physical ambush, but the blinding, toxic suffocation of the London pea souper fog. Forget everything you know about bad weather. This wasn't just mist. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of industrial coal smoke, sulfur, and freezing river dampness that trapped the city in a literal visual void. The wealthy West End had brilliant electric lights and bright gas lamps to cut through the gloom. The East End? It was plunged into an almost prehistoric darkness, lit only by scattered, sputtering flames that barely illuminated a radius of 3 feet. This environmental blackout was utterly devastating because of a very specific, incredibly rigid protocol called the beat system. A Victorian policeman did not simply wander his district, he walked a mathematically calculated route, timed to the exact minute. He had to be at specific intersections at specific times to meet his sergeant. If he was early, he was suspected of loitering. If he was late, he faced severe disciplinary action or outright dismissal. This creates a terrifying psychological trap. The officer is locked into a predictable path, forced to march blindly through an environment where visibility is absolutely zero. He couldn't see his own boots striking the wet cobblestones. He couldn't see the brick walls he brushed his shoulders against. He was entirely robbed of his primary senses, but he could hear. And that was infinitely worse. Because in the blinding smog, every echoing footstep could be an innocent dock worker. Or it could be a syndicate enforcer holding a heavy iron pipe. You are completely exposed, entirely vulnerable, and mathematically predictable to anyone hunting you. The isolation is complete. You cannot call for backup because nobody can see your lantern. You cannot run because you don't know what you're running into. This is pure, unadulterated sensory deprivation layered with the constant, crushing threat of sudden harm. It brings us to a fascinating psychological dilemma, and I want you to answer this honestly. Imagine walking a designated path in absolute blindness, knowing that deviating by 1 inch could cost your career, but staying on the path might cost you everything else. Would you break the rules? The anxiety of that choice gnawed at the sanity of the H Division every single night. And when the freezing fog finally forced an officer to seek the dim, flickering light of indoor spaces, he stumbled into fortresses built strictly for the damned. Part 6. Sanctuaries of the Damned. The common lodging houses were impenetrable urban fortresses where up to 800 desperate souls crammed into a single, suffocating room. The bitter cold and the paralyzing fog of the streets were brutal, but stepping indoors was often a massive, terrifying miscalculation. For the thousands of transient, starving, and fugitive residents of Whitechapel, traditional housing didn't exist. Instead, they relied on the doss houses, massive, poorly ventilated warehouses of absolute human misery. For a few pennies, you could rent a 4-penny coffin, a literal wooden box to sleep in. For even less, you could simply pay to sit on a bench and lean over a taut rope to rest your head, the infamous 2-penny hangover. When you cram hundreds of unwashed, starving, deeply traumatized individuals into a single, sealed environment, you don't just get a room. You get a ticking psychological time bomb. The sheer wall of heat radiating from 800 sleeping bodies was physically overwhelming. The stench of stale gin, damp clothing, and illness was so thick it aggressively coated the back of your throat. But the true danger for the police wasn't the smell. It was the impenetrable legal and social wall these massive houses represented. The Metropolitan Police operated in a massive gray area here. They had incredibly limited jurisdiction to enter these private properties without specific, hard-to-obtain warrants, which meant these sprawling dark buildings became ultimate sanctuaries for anyone running from the badge. If a suspect sprinted through the doors of a common lodging house, they simply vanished into an ocean of hostile faces. For a lone police officer, deciding to push through those doors to pursue a criminal was an act of near-suicidal bravery. You are stepping off the street and into a locked subterranean cellar filled entirely with people who view your uniform as the ultimate enemy. There is no backup. There is no communication. There is only the flickering light of a central fire pit, reflecting off hundreds of pairs of eyes staring intensely out of the shadows. So, ask yourself this, feeling the claustrophobic heat of that room and the weight of those glares. Could you step alone into an unventilated, subterranean cellar holding hundreds of hostile strangers, knowing your only weapon is a wooden stick? The moment the heavy wooden door slammed shut behind you, the terrifying reality set in. Inside those damp walls, a single scream for police backup would be swallowed whole, drowned out by a community that had sworn a terrifying oath against the law. Part 7. The Wall of Silence. Following the violent Trafalgar Square clashes of 1887, the East End completely severed its ties with the law, viewing the police not as protectors, but as an occupying army. To understand the absolute terror of walking a beat in 1888, you must understand the deep, festering political wound that was inflicted just months prior. Known historically as Bloody Sunday, the Metropolitan Police violently clashed with thousands of starving, desperate protesters right in the heart of London. The batons were swung freely. The horses charged into the crowds. And when the dust settled, the East End did not forget, and they certainly did not forgive. The H Division was no longer seen as a flawed but necessary public service. They were the visible, uniformed enforcers of the very wealthy establishment that was actively keeping the district trapped in squalor, which means every single officer was walking through enemy territory. The social isolation was profound, and deeply psychological. Imagine the horrifying reality of an officer actually managing to catch a fleeing suspect. The suspect turns, a scuffle breaks out, and the officer quickly realizes he is outmatched. He reaches for his brass whistle, the universal Victorian cry for immediate backup. The shrill sound pierces the thick, freezing fog, bouncing desperately off the damp brick walls of the rookeries. He expects to hear heavy boots running to his aid. He expects the public to intervene. Instead, he hears the terrifying, coordinated sound of locks clicking into place. Heavy wooden shutters are slammed shut. Iron deadbolts are thrown. The flickering lights in the windows are abruptly blown out. The local residents didn't just refuse to help, they actively retreated into the darkness, sealing the officer in the street with his attackers. It was the ultimate unspoken community betrayal. The silence that followed the blast of a police whistle was heavier and far more dangerous than any riot. It was a cold, calculated abandonment. The community was sending a crystal clear message. If you wear the Crown's uniform, your survival is absolutely not our problem. I want you to really think about that profound level of alienation. If the very people you were sworn to protect bolted their heavy wooden doors the moment you begged for help, how long before your mind broke? A man can fight a physical enemy, but he cannot fight an entire community that wishes he would simply disappear. This complete social isolation was mentally crushing, but in the late summer of 1888, the oppressive darkness finally started hunting them back. Part 8. The Autumn Paranoia. In the fading summer of 1888, the district abruptly ceased to be a mere Victorian slum and mutated into an active, breathing nightmare. The baseline level of danger was already at a breaking point, but then the atmosphere fundamentally fractured. It started in late August, a subtle but undeniable shift in the wind. This was the beginning of what history would forever brand as the Autumn of Terror. But we are not going to focus on the grim, anatomical tragedies of those nights. We are going to focus on the suffocating, paralyzing reaction that gripped the greatest city on Earth by the throat. Because practically overnight, the threat stopped being something you could punch with a truncheon and became a phantom you couldn't even see. The streets of Whitechapel, usually teeming with transient workers and late-night hawkers, instantly emptied. The taverns closed their heavy doors early. A chilling, unnatural quiet descended over the alleys, broken only by the sound of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. Mobs of terrified, desperate local men marching through the smog, carrying crude torches and heavy sticks. They didn't trust the police to protect them, so they took the night back themselves. This added an unbearable layer of pure chaos. The police weren't just hunting an invisible threat. They were trying to prevent a terrified, heavily armed populace from tearing itself apart in the dark. And then came the devastating realization that shattered the Metropolitan Police's confidence entirely. Their Victorian methods were completely, undeniably useless. You cannot whistle for backup against a ghost. You cannot use a wooden baton to strike a shadow that strikes with surgical precision and immediately vanishes without a single trace into the unmapped courtyards. The H Division was using a 19th century toolkit against a profoundly modern psychological terror. The officers began to look over their own shoulders. The sheer unpredictability of the nights turned every single alleyway into a potential trap. The uniform offered zero immunity. This forces an incredibly difficult question about the nature of authority. How do you police a phantom that leaves absolutely no trace, knowing the next shadow in the alley could be the very myth that is paralyzing the nation? You don't. You simply pray your designated beat doesn't intersect with the monster's path. The hunt wasn't just a string of unsolved cases anymore. It was the catalyst for the complete psychological collapse of the Victorian policeman. Part 9. The Breaking of the Bobby. Standing frozen under the hiss of a dying gas lamp, the elite Victorian policeman finally realized his uniform was no longer a shield. It was a glowing target. Let's strip away the historical detachment and drop right into the brutal, physical reality of the job. A standard night shift was completely unforgiving. An officer was expected to walk roughly 15 miles a night across uneven, slippery cobblestones. 15 miles in heavy, restrictive wool clothing. 15 miles while shivering in bone-chilling, damp cold. But the physical exhaustion was nothing compared to the corrosive, relentless adrenaline dump. Your heart is constantly racing. Every single sense is dialed up to maximum capacity. You are straining your eyes against a thick, sulfurous fog that burns your lungs. You are listening intensely for the faintest scrape of a boot on a brick. The hissing of the gas lamps sounds exactly like whispered voices. The shadows stretching across the brick spiderweb look exactly like lunging figures. And you have to sustain this level of agonizing hypervigilance for hours on end, completely isolated from the rest of the world. It is a mathematical certainty that the human nervous system will eventually snap. And that is exactly what happened. The illusion of imperial control shattered. The British Empire, with all its vast global wealth, its massive navies, and its unshakable arrogance, meant absolutely nothing in this specific square mile. The rules of Queen Victoria did not penetrate the smog. When a young, exhausted rookie stood alone in a dark Whitechapel court, feeling the icy moisture seep through his boots, the badges and the brass buttons suddenly felt incredibly fragile. He wasn't a symbol of the law anymore. He was just a terrified man holding a piece of wood in the dark. I want you to seriously drop yourself into that exact moment. Put yourself under that flickering gas lamp, completely isolated in the freezing fog, listening to heavy footsteps rapidly approach from a blind corner. Would you surrender your badge just to save your sanity? There is no shame in admitting you would walk away. These men were asked to do the impossible. They were pushed to the absolute jagged edge of human endurance, staring directly into an abyss that simply refused to blink first. Part 10. The Unconquered Dark. The undeniable historical truth is that the greatest law enforcement agency in the world never actually won the battle for the East End in 1888. They merely survived it. We love to consume history as a neat, resolved narrative. We want the heroes to figure out a new strategy, overcome the overwhelming odds, and bring light into the darkness. But the East End did not operate by the rules of a cinematic script. There was no grand victory for the H Division. They didn't suddenly crack the architectural code of the rookeries. They didn't solve the crushing economic despair that fueled the shadow gangs. And they certainly never caught the phantom that turned their nightly patrols into a waking nightmare. The autumn of terror eventually faded, but the suffocating dread did not. The police force was thoroughly, utterly humbled by an environment that was fundamentally broken. The poverty was too deep. The twisted geometry of the blind alleys was too complex. The sheer human desperation was simply too loud to be silenced by a wooden truncheon and a brass whistle. The events of 1888 passed into the realm of dark legend, but the heavy psychological shadows remained deeply embedded in the wet cobblestones for generations. The Metropolitan Police learned a brutal lesson about the limitations of authority when faced with total, systemic collapse. It begs a terrifying final thought about the very nature of order and civilization. Knowing what lurked in the fog, the architecture, and the silence, Do you believe any modern police force could have truly controlled those streets? Even with our radios, our vehicles, and our bright tactical lights, a labyrinth of true desperation will always find a way to swallow the law whole. The empire eventually built a modern world, but it left behind a square mile of shadows that proved, once and for all, that the dark is never truly conquered. It just waits.